The Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly stretched for nearly a mile in every direction. Floating platforms held delegates from 1,000 worlds, their bodies shaped by evolution under alien suns. Some were made of living crystal. Others existed as clouds of sentient gas held together by magnetic fields. A few looked almost human, but their eyes held the weight of civilizations that had risen and fallen before. Earth's first fish crawled onto land. Grace Holloway stood on the small platform assigned to humanity. It floated at the very edge of the chamber, far from the center where the elder races gathered. She wore a simple gray suit, her dark hair pulled back, her face calm. She had learned quickly that showing emotion here was seen as a sign of a primitive mind. The Valtteri delegate was speaking. His body was made of pale blue crystal that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. His voice rang like a bell, beautiful and cold. The human species has achieved faster than light travel, Elder Kethvorin announced. This is notable. However, our assessment remains unchanged. They are a young species, fragile. Their lifespans are measured in decades, not centuries. They feel too much. They break too easily. Grace listened without expression. She had heard this speech before, in different forms, from different species. Humanity had joined the galactic community 3 years ago, full of hope and wonder. They had found not friendship, but polite dismissal. Our archives contain records from their world, Kethvorin continued. Stories of warriors and battles. Tales of soldiers who ran toward death rather than away from it. They speak of something called honor, of sacrifice, of fighting to the last breath. The crystal being made a sound like wind chimes. It took Grace a moment to realize he was laughing. Every young species tells such stories. They are always exaggerated, always false. A way to feel important in a universe that has forgotten more civilizations than they can imagine. Other delegates joined in the laughter. The sound filled the great hall, echoing off walls that had stood for 12,000 years. Grace said nothing. She simply watched and remembered. She remembered her grandfather's stories about his father, who had landed on a beach under enemy fire when he was 19 years old. She remembered visiting the memorial wall in Washington, running her fingers over names of men and women who had given everything. She remembered the words carved in stone at 100 battlefields across Earth. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them believe what they want. The session ended without any formal acknowledgement of humanity's presence. As Grace's platform floated toward the exit, a young Valtteri approached her. His crystal form was a deeper blue than the elders, and his movements were quick and curious. Ambassador Holloway, he said. I am Selvorn. I study primitive species. I hope you are not offended. Not at all, Grace said evenly. Your species interest me. Your stories are quite detailed. The names, the places, the numbers of dead. If they were pure invention, they would be less specific, yes. Grace looked at the young scholar. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a small smile. What do you think, Selvorn? Before he could answer, alarms began to sound throughout the station. The news came in fragments at first, then in a flood. A Valtteri colony world called Ashkara Prime was under attack. The enemy was the Sketh Swarm, a nightmare species from the dark spaces between galaxies. They were not intelligent in the way the Assembly understood intelligence. They did not build or create or negotiate. They simply consumed. Trillions of chitinous bodies moving as one, guided by a hunger that could never be satisfied. The Sketh had not been seen in 3,000 years. The galaxy had believed them extinct. They were wrong. Grace watched the emergency session from her distant platform. The delegates argued and debated. Some wanted to send warships. Others said it was too late, that the military resources needed were too far away. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Ashkara Prime held 3 million Valtteri civilians. The swarm numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The colony's shields would fail in 72 hours. Evacuation was impossible. Rescue was impossible. "We must accept this loss," Elder Kethvorin said, his voice heavy. "The colony is beyond salvation. We will honor their memory." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. 3 million souls, written off with a speech. 3 million thinking, feeling beings, abandoned because the numbers were inconvenient. She opened a communication channel to Earth. The response came within minutes. The Terran Defense Force had been monitoring the situation. Admiral Carl Hughes appeared on her screen, his weathered face grim. "We've run the numbers too, Ambassador. It's bad. Can we help?" Grace asked Dodd. There was a pause. "We have a regiment in the sector. The 5th orbital drop. 800 soldiers. They can reach Ashkara Prime in 18 hours. 800 against hundreds of thousands." "Yes, ma'am." "That's about the size of it." Grace closed her eyes. She knew what she should say. She should say it was not their fight, not their people, not their responsibility. Humanity owed the Velthari nothing. Less than nothing, considering how they had been treated. "Have you asked for volunteers?" She said instead. Another pause. "We have." Every single soldier in the 5th stepped forward. Colonel Danny Vance is already loading transports. Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest. Cutting through the cold. Pride. Ancient and deep and utterly human. "Then we go," she said. "Ambassador, you understand what this means. If we do this and fail, if we lose 800 soldiers on a mission that isn't our responsibility, there will be consequences. Political consequences. The Assembly already sees us as primitive." Grace thought of her grandfather's stories. She thought of beaches and jungles and frozen mountains, of flags raised over impossible ground, of letters that began with, "We regret to inform you." She thought of every monument to every soldier who had ever chosen to stand when running was easier. "Let them watch," she said. "Let them see what primitives do." The communication ended. Grace turned to face the Great Hall, where the elder races were already moving on to other business. Ashkara Prime already forgotten. "You think our stories are legends," she thought. "You think we invented heroes because we needed to believe in something." She smiled, and it was not a diplomatic smile. "You're about to learn the truth." The TSS Iron Vanguard was not a beautiful ship. She was built for war, not for show. Her hull was scarred from a dozen engagements, patched and welded and patched again. She smelled of oil and sweat and recycled air. She was home to 800 soldiers who had just volunteered to die. Colonel Danny Vance stood in the cargo bay, watching his people prepare. They checked weapons, loaded ammunition, wrote letters they hoped would never be sent. Some prayed. Others laughed and joked, because that was how they dealt with fear. All of them had chosen to be here. Danny was 43 years old. He had joined the service at 18, fought in 3 campaigns, buried more friends than he could count. His hair was gray at the temples now, and his left knee ached when the weather changed. He had planned to retire next year, maybe buy a small farm somewhere quiet. Those plans seemed very far away now. Sergeant Kyle Brennan approached him, a medical kit slung over his shoulder. Kyle was 31, built like a truck, with hands that could crush stone but handled wounded soldiers like they were made of glass. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors helped neighbors and nobody locked their doors. "Colonel," Kyle said, "the med bay is ready. We've got enough supplies for about 3 days of heavy combat." "And after 3 days?" Kyle shrugged. "Then we start getting creative, sir." Danny nodded. He had known Kyle for 6 years. The man had pulled soldiers out of burning vehicles, performed surgery in the middle of firefights, and once carried 3 wounded men 2 miles through enemy territory because the evacuation craft was shot down. He had never once complained. "How are the others?" Danny asked. "Ready. Scared, but ready. You know how it is." Danny did know. Fear was not the enemy. Fear was natural, healthy, human. The enemy was giving into fear, letting it control you. His soldiers had learned to carry fear like a weight in their pockets. Acknowledged but never in charge, Lieutenant Amy Torres walked past, her flight suit already zipped up. She was 28, small and quick, with dark eyes that never seemed to blink. Her grandmother had crossed the desert on foot to reach America 70 years ago. Amy had grown up on stories of that journey, of a woman who walked through hell because something better waited on the other side. "Lieutenant," Danny called out, "how many fighters do we have?" 12, sir." "Not enough. It never is." Amy smiled, a quick flash of teeth. "Then we'll just have to fly twice as hard." She walked away toward the hangar, already running calculations in her head. Danny watched her go and felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. These people trusted him. They would follow him into the fire because he asked them to. That trust was the heaviest burden any leader could carry. In the corner of the cargo bay, a young soldier sat alone, writing on a piece of paper with an actual pen. Danny walked over and sat down beside him. Corporal Ethan Shaw was 19 years old. He had been in the service for exactly 14 months. His face still had the softness of youth, and his eyes had not yet learned the distant look that came with too many battles. He looked up as Danny approached, startled. "Sir, sorry, I was just writing a letter?" Danny said gently. Ethan nodded. "To my mom. Just in case." Danny was quiet for a moment. He remembered being 19, remembered thinking he was invincible, remembered learning he was not. He wondered what Ethan's mother looked like, whether she had any idea where her son was going. "That's good," Danny finally said. "That's important. You say what you need to say." "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." Ethan's young face was serious. "Why are we doing this? The Veltri don't like us. They laugh at us. Why are we going to die for them?" Danny considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "You know the history of our species?" he asked. "Some of it. We learned it in school. Then you know about the wars, the famines, the plagues, all the terrible things we did to each other over the centuries." Ethan nodded slowly. "But you also know about the other things. The hospitals we built, the children we saved, the times we crossed oceans to help strangers we had never met." Danny leaned forward. "We're not good people because we've never done bad things. We're good people because we keep trying to do better. Because when we see someone in trouble, something in us says we have to help. It doesn't matter if they're grateful. It doesn't matter if they deserve it. It matters that we try." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he folded his letter carefully and put it in his pocket. "I think I understand, sir." "Good. Now get some rest. It's going to be a long few days." Danny stood and walked to the observation window. Outside, stars streamed past as the Iron Vanguard raced toward Ashkar Prime. Somewhere ahead, 3 million beings waited to die. They did not know that help was coming. They did not know that 800 humans had looked at impossible odds and said yes anyway. Admiral Carl Hughes had asked Danny before departure if he understood what he was agreeing to. Danny had looked at his soldiers, at the men and women who had stepped forward without hesitation, and he had understood perfectly. This was who they were. This was who humanity had always been. Not perfect, not always right, but always willing to walk into the dark for someone else. The Galactic Assembly thought human stories were legends. They thought courage was something primitive species invented to comfort themselves. They had lived in peace for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to fight for something beyond. Survival. Danny touched the cold glass of the observation window. In 18 hours, they would reach Ashkara Prime. In 18 hours, the fighting would begin. He thought of all the soldiers who had stood where he stood now. Throughout history, facing battles they were not expected to win. They had left behind letters and prayers and hope. They had walked into the fire anyway. "We're coming," he whispered to the stars. "Hold on. We're coming." The Iron Vanguard flew on through the darkness, carrying 800 ordinary people toward an extraordinary fate. Ashkara Prime was burning when they arrived. The colony world had once been beautiful. Crystal forests stretched across its surface, catching the light of twin suns and turning the landscape into a sea of color. The Velthari had built their cities to match, towers of shaped glass rising toward the sky, each one a work of art that had taken centuries to complete. Now smoke rose from those towers. The crystal forests had been shattered, ground into dust beneath the endless tide of the swarm. From orbit, Colonel Danny Vance could see them moving across the surface like a living shadow. Millions of bodies crawling toward the last remaining dome. "God help us," someone whispered behind him. Danny said nothing. He had seen the numbers. He had known what they were facing. But seeing it with his own eyes was different. The Sketh were not an army. They were a force of nature, a hurricane made of claws and hunger. The drop was rough. Enemy flyers filled the sky, and 3 transport ships went down before they reached the ground. 60 soldiers lost before the battle even began. The survivors landed in a ring around the central dome, where 3 million Velthari civilians huddled behind failing shields. The Velthari military was there, but they were broken. Their elegant weapons had not been designed for this kind of fight. They had forgotten how to hold a line. Danny gathered his officers in the shadow of the dome. The ground beneath their feet was gray ash, the remains of a forest that had stood for 10,000 years. "We dig in here," he said. "Trenches, barriers, overlapping fields of fire. We make them pay for every inch." A Velthari commander approached. Her crystalline form was cracked in several places, and she moved with the stiffness of someone who had not slept in days. Her name was Selthara, and she had been trying to hold her people together with nothing but willpower. "You are the humans," she said. "We received word you were coming." I did not believe it. "Believe it," Danny said. "Where do you need us?" Selthara looked at the humans with something between confusion and wonder. "Why are you here? Your species owes us nothing. Your government has no treaty with ours." The assembly said no one was coming. Sergeant Kyle Brennan walked past, carrying a wounded Velthari child in his arms. The child's crystal body was shattered along one arm, leaking fluid that glowed faintly blue. Kyle handled her like she was made of glass, which she was. "Hey, Doc," he called to a medic. "Got another one. She's losing fluid fast." The medic ran over, and together they began treating the child with supplies designed for human bodies, adapting on the fly. The Velthari mother watched with tears running down her crystal face. Selthara stared at the scene. "I do not understand," she said quietly. Danny looked at her. "Ma'am, with respect, you don't need to understand. You just need to point us at the enemy." The trenches went up fast. Humans, it turned out, were very good at digging holes and filling them with soldiers. Lieutenant Amy Torres got her fighters in the air, running constant patrols, buying time for the ground forces to prepare. The Velthari watched in confusion as humans moved earth and rock with their bare hands, building walls where none had stood before. "This is primitive," Selthara said again. "You cannot stop the swarm with dirt and metal." Kyle looked up from treating another wounded civilian. His hands were covered in blue fluid. "Ma'am, we've been fighting in dirt for 10,000 years. We're pretty good at it." The first wave hit at dawn. Danny had thought he was ready. He was wrong. The Sketh came like a black tide, pouring over the hills, climbing over their own dead to reach the human lines. They had no weapons, only claws and teeth and numbers beyond counting. They screamed as they charged, a sound that cut through the air like broken glass. "Open fire!" The guns spoke, and the swarm died. Hundreds fell in the first minute, then thousands. But more kept coming. Always more. Danny stood on the line with his rifle in his hands, because that was where his people were. He had always believed a leader should never ask soldiers to do something he was not willing to do himself. So he stood beside them, firing until his weapon overheated, then firing again. The Velthorus soldiers tried to help, but they were not built for this. Their weapons overheated. Their bodies cracked under stress. They did not know how to dig in and hold, but they watched the humans. And they learned. By noon, the first trench had fallen. Danny pulled his people back to the second line, fighting every step of the way. Corporal Ethan Shaw carried ammunition until his legs gave out, then crawled. Kyle Brennan treated wounds while bullets flew past his head, never once ducking. Night fell, and the fighting continued. The Sketh did not sleep, did not rest, did not stop. But neither did the humans. Amy Torres flew sortie after sortie, her fighter held together by emergency welds and prayers. She lost 2 pilots in the darkness, but she kept flying. In the trenches, soldiers who had been awake for 20 hours kept firing, because stopping meant dying. The second day was worse. The Sketh adapted, learning to avoid the kill zones, finding weak points in the line. Danny moved reserves like chess pieces, plugging holes, reinforcing sections about to break. By sunset, they had lost 200 soldiers. The perimeter was shrinking. Selthar found Danny at a medical station, getting a wound on his arm bandaged. He had not even noticed being hit. "How do you do this?" she asked. "How do you keep fighting when you know you cannot win?" Danny looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Because giving up means everyone in that dome dies. As long as we stand, they live, but you are dying." "Yes," Danny said simply. "We know." Selthar was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she knelt in the human way of respect. Her crystal body caught the firelight, glowing like a sunset. "Then we will die with you," she said. Danny reached out and helped her stand. "No," he said. "We're going to live. All of us. We just have to hold a little longer." He did not know if he believed it, but he said it anyway, because hope was a weapon too. And sometimes, hope was the only weapon that mattered. On the morning of the third day, Danny Vance knew they were going to lose. The numbers did not lie. 600 soldiers dead or wounded. Ammunition running low. The third defensive line was crumbling. The Sketh had learned human tactics, and they were adapting faster than the defenders could. Respond. And then the shield generator started to fail. The generator was the only thing keeping the central dome safe. If it went down, the swarm would pour through and 3 million civilians would die screaming. Engineers worked desperately to repair the damage, but they needed time. Time Danny did not have. He gathered his officers in a crater that had once been a command post. Kyle Brennan was there, his uniform soaked in blood that was not all his own. Amy Torres had landed her damaged fighter and joined them on the ground. Ethan Shaw stood quietly in the corner, his young face aged by 3 days of hell. "The generator needs 20 minutes, Danny said. "The swarm is concentrating their assault on Sector 7. If they break through there, it's over." "How many of them?" Amy asked. "Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands." Silence. Everyone in that crater knew what Danny was going to say next. They had known since they volunteered for this mission. "I need soldiers who can still fight. We push into the swarm. We hit them hard enough to disrupt their assault. We buy those 20 minutes. Kyle spoke first. "I'm in." "Me too," Amy said. One by one, the others stepped forward. Not because they were ordered to, because they were human. Danny looked at Ethan. The boy was 19 years old. He had a mother waiting for him back home, a letter in his pocket that said all the things he had never been able to say out loud. "Shaw, you don't have to. I'm in, sir," Ethan said. His voice was steady. His hands were not shaking. Somewhere in the last 3 days, he had stopped being a boy. They gathered everyone who could still walk. 47 soldiers. The last combat effective force on Ashkar Prime. Danny looked at them. These 47 men and women who had followed him into hell. They were covered in blood and ash. Their weapons were damaged, their bodies broken. But their eyes were clear. "You know what we're about to do," he said. "You know most of us won't come back. I won't lie to you. I won't tell you this is going to be easy. But I will tell you this." He took a breath. 3 million people are counting on us. They don't know our names. They'll probably never know we were here. But they'll live because we stood. And that's enough. That's always been enough for people like us. No one spoke. No one needed to. Danny raised his rifle. Into the fire. They charged. The swarm saw them coming and turned to meet them. Thousands of chitinous bodies, claws gleaming in the smoke-filled air. The odds were impossible. The math said they would all die in the first minute. The math did not know human beings. Danny fired as he ran, each shot dropping a scath. Beside him, Kyle moved like a machine, covering wounded soldiers even as he pushed forward. Amy had grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier, fighting on the ground for the first time in her life. They hit the swarm like a fist. For a moment, just a moment, the endless tide stopped. Then the fighting became close. Rifles gave way to pistols. Pistols gave way to knives. Knives gave way to fists and teeth and pure stubborn human will. Danny lost track of time. He lost track of everything except the enemy in front of him and the soldiers beside him. He took wounds he did not feel, killed enemies he did not count. The world narrowed to a single burning point of survival. Kyle Brennan dragged wounded soldiers to cover while bleeding from a dozen cuts. His medical supplies had run out hours ago, but he kept working, tearing strips from his own uniform to bandage wounds. When a Sketh lunged at a fallen soldier, Kyle beat it to death with his bare hands. Amy Torres ran out of ammunition and picked up a piece of broken metal. She fought with it like it was a sword, dancing between enemies, too fast to hit. When a Sketh command cluster moved to coordinate the assault, she spotted it. Without hesitation, she ran back to her fighter, took off, and crashed it directly into the cluster. She ejected at the last second, landing in enemy territory, and then fought her way back to friendly lines on foot. Ethan Shaw found himself alone at a breached section of the line. The Sketh poured through, heading for the generator. There was no one else. No reinforcements, no backup, no hope. He held them anyway. For 11 minutes, Ethan stood in that breach. He fired until his rifle was empty. He threw grenades until he had none left. He picked up a broken piece of metal from a destroyed vehicle and used it as a club. When reinforcements finally reached him, he was still standing. The ground around him was covered in dead Sketh. His uniform was torn to shreds. Blood ran from wounds he could not count. Danny reached him first. "Shaw!" Ethan looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "Didn't want to let you down, sir," he said. Then he collapsed. Danny caught him, lowered him gently to the ground. "Medic! I need a medic now!" Kyle came running, his hands already moving to check Ethan's wounds. "He's alive, barely. Get me a stretcher." Behind them, the shield generator hummed back to life. The engineers had finished the repairs. The dome was safe. The swarm, disrupted by the human assault, had lost their momentum. Confusion spread through their ranks. For the first time in 3 days, they hesitated. Of the 47 soldiers who had charged into the fire, 23 survived. Danny stood among the dead and the dying, his rifle empty, his body broken. He looked at the dome, at the 3 million lives they had just saved, and he felt something he had not felt in days. Hope. The Sketh were still out there. The battle was not over, but they had bought time. They had held the line. They had done the impossible, and somewhere across the galaxy, help was finally on its way. The Galactic Assembly fleet arrived on the 4th day. 1,200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Ashkara Prime, their weapon systems already charging. They had expected to find ruins and corpses, the remains of a colony that had been written off as lost. Instead, they found something impossible. The colony still stood. The swarm, caught between the human defenders and the arriving fleet, broke apart. Without their coordination, they became easy targets. Within hours, the last of the Sketh had been destroyed. On the surface, the survivors emerged from the trenches. 800 humans had landed 4 days ago. 163 were still alive. Many of those would carry scars for the rest of their lives. All of them would carry memories. Colonel Danny Vance refused evacuation until every one of his soldiers had been loaded onto medical ships. His arm was in a sling. His face was gray with exhaustion. But he stood at the loading zone, shaking hands with each survivor, speaking words of thanks to soldiers who had given everything. Colonel Vance, Danny turned. A Valkyrie approached him, his crystal body glowing with the soft light of the morning sun. It was Elder Kethvorn himself, leader of the Valkyrie Council, the same being who had laughed at human stories just days before. Now there was no laughter in his eyes, only wonder. "You came," Kethvorn said. "You had no reason to come. No treaty, no obligation, no debt. We dismissed your species as primitive. We mocked your history as legend. And still you came." Danny looked at the elder for a long moment. Behind him, Kyle Brennan was teaching a young Valkyrie medic how to apply a tourniquet. The Valkyrie's crystal hands fumbled with the unfamiliar material, but he kept trying, kept learning. Kyle praised each small success, patient as always. "We didn't come for gratitude," Danny said finally. "We came because it was the right thing to do." "I do not understand." Kethvorn's voice was soft, uncertain. He was thousands of years old, had seen civilizations rise and fall, but this was beyond his experience. "Your species lives for decades, not centuries. Every soldier you lost represents a significant portion of their life. How can you value sacrifice so highly when your time is already so short?" Danny thought about the question. He thought about Ethan Shaw, 19 years old, standing alone in a breach for 11 minutes. He thought about Amy Torres crashing her fighter into the enemy without hesitation. He thought about Kyle Brennan treating wounds until his hands were raw. "Maybe that's why," he said. "We know we don't have much time, so we make it count." A Valkyrie child ran past them, laughing. In her crystalline hands, she held a piece of paper. Danny recognized the drawing, a stick figure in human armor, standing between a group of monsters and a family. One of the surviving soldiers must have given it to her. Kethvorn watched the child run into her mother's arms. 3 million lives," he said. "Because of you, 3 million of my people will see tomorrow. Their children will grow old. Their stories will continue." "That's enough," Danny said. "That's always been enough." 1 week later, Ambassador Grace Holloway stood before the Galactic Assembly. The Great Hall was silent. No delegate whispered to their neighbor. No platform floated away on unrelated business. Every eye in the chamber was focused on the small human woman standing at the center, where only the eldest races had ever stood before. "You called our history legends," Grace said. Her voice carried across the mile-wide chamber, amplified by systems that had been built before humanity discovered fire. "You said our stories were exaggerated. You believed that courage and sacrifice were inventions of a primitive species desperate for meaning. She paused, letting the silence build. You have ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years. You have built wonders beyond counting. But somewhere along the way, you forgot something important. Grace looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who had lived for centuries. You forgot what it means to fight for someone other than yourself. You forgot what it means to stand when running is easier. You forgot that the measure of a species is not how long they live, but how they choose to spend the time they have. On a platform near the center, Selthara sat among the Velthari delegates. Her crystal body still bore cracks from the battle, scars she had chosen not to heal. "I was there," she said, her voice ringing through the hall. "I saw humans dig trenches with their bare hands. I saw them carry our wounded while bullets flew. I saw them charge into the swarm with nothing but rifles and courage, not for glory, but because 3 million strangers needed them." She stood, the formal gesture of respect. "These are not legends. I watched them happen. I am alive because humans walked into the fire for me." One by one, other delegates stood. Velthari, who had survived the colony. Members of species who had heard the reports, seen the footage, counted the human dead. The chamber filled with the sound of movement, of respect being given where respect was due. Grace waited until the noise died down. "You wondered if our stories were true," she said. "You wondered if humans could really be what our history claimed. Let me tell you something about humanity." She straightened her shoulders, and for a moment she looked like every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. "We are not ancient. We did not live for centuries. We make mistakes, and we feel too much, and we break too easily. But when we see someone in trouble, something in us says we have to help. It doesn't matter if they're grateful. It doesn't matter if they deserve it. We help because helping is who we are." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "You called us ancient legends," Grace said. "Now you know the truth." She paused, and her smile was the smile of every soldier who had ever held a line. "We're not legends. We're just human. And that's enough." Back on Ashkar Prime, a memorial was being built. It would stand for 10,000 years, a testament to the beings who had walked into the fire when no one else would dot at its base. Carved in crystal that would never fade were the words that Danny Vance had spoken when asked why humans had come to die for strangers. "Because it was the right thing to do. That's always been enough for us."